Hello and welcome. We're Sisters in Crime Australia and we've been celebrating women's crime writing since 1991. Welcome to our very first episode of Murder Mondays, where we invite an author to talk about her crime craft. I'm Karina Kilmore. I'm a debut crime writer, I'm a journalist, and I'm a convener with Sisters in Crime. Before I introduce Val McDermid, Queen of Tartan Noir and very good friend of Sisters in Crime, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and recognising their continued connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We're honoured to have you with us, Val. So many readers know you and your work. 45 best-selling crime books under your belt and 5 series, including the Tony Hill, Carol Jordan books, which were made into the very successful Wire in the Blood TV series. Plus numerous awards, too many to mention, but including the Cartier Diamond Dagger and of course our personal favourite, your appearances at 6 of our very own Sisters in Crime events. Before we get to questions, can you please give us the elevator pitch for your latest novel, How the Dead Speak?
Well, How the Dead Speak is the 11th novel to feature Tony Hill and Carol Jordan, and it sees them in a very strange place, or rather, 2 very strange places. The crime plot of the novel centres around a former convent where developers discover a lot of skeletons when they start to dig up the grounds, and these skeletons date back to when it was still a convent, but as the investigations proceed, a whole other bunch of skeletons emerge from the ground, and it's these 2 strands that twist around each other that manage to bring Tony and Carol sort of together by the end of the book.
Okay, good to know. All right, we'll get on to our questions. I'm going to give a little shuffle and then we're just going to go with the flow. First up, oh, this is a good one to start with. How do you write about sex?
Mostly I don't. Because for the first, probably about 20 odd, probably 27, 28 of my books, my mother was still alive. So I wasn't going to write about sex when my mother was going to read it. That'd be too difficult. I think that my general rule of thumb about sex is that it's much easier to do good sex than it is to write good sex. And there are problems, I think, with sex scenes in crime novels for 2 reasons. One is that it slows down the action, it slows down the development of the plot. And the other thing is, if a character that you've really invested in and identified with behaves in a way in bed that you're not comfortable with, you lose your connection to that character. I remember this very early on from one of the leading early lesbian crime writers, and I read a scene with her character in bed, and I just thought, I don't like you. So it's problematic. I think I only use it if it's the only way to tell you something about a character or the way to advance the plot. Yeah. And the other crucial thing about sex is, no matter how many murders you write, nobody thinks that's how you spend your Saturday night. Nobody thinks, I bet she goes around the streets of Edinburgh killing folk. But you write one sex scene, and everybody thinks, that's what she does in bed.
It's tattooed for life. Yeah. Okay, what is your writing routine?
I don't know that I would really describe it as a routine. I write between January and sort of March, April every year because the weather's rubbish and you might as well be indoors. So I always start off quite slowly. The first 6 weeks of the book, I won't write very much because I'm feeling my way into the characters, feeling my way into the story and the atmosphere. And then it picks up pace and I write much more productively. But I don't have set hours or set number of words every day. I'm usually at my desk about 10 o'clock in the morning. And then first thing I do is revise what I've done the day before or read a bigger chunk the week before. And then I start writing probably about 11 o'clock, fueled by coffee and porridge. And if you go and look online on YouTube, you can find Hamish's hipster porridge, which is one of the things that features in the Karen Perry novels. I tend to write in chunks. I'll write for about 20 minutes, half an hour, and then I'll stop and do something else, check my email, go to the post office, make a cup of coffee, play a computer game, and then I come back and do another chunk. And so the day progresses in those bite-sized chunks. And sometimes I'll carry on writing after dinner, but mostly I stop around about 7 o'clock-ish. Although when we've been in lockdown, I've been stopping a bit earlier than that so we can go for our legally permitted exercise. So we go off for a yomp around Edinburgh, around the parks and the river and the deserted city streets for an hour.
Oh, sounds lovely. How do you decide a scene of a crime?
It kind of depends very much on the way the way I want the story to progress. So sometimes a scene of crime just suggests itself. I know I need to start the book with the body. So, for example, with a book like The Distant Echo, I knew that book opened with the discovery of a body on a winter's night, and I just had to find a suitably atmospheric location for it. And that came almost by accident. I planned to put the body in the graveyard of the ruined cathedral in St Andrews. And I went off to St Andrews to do some research, and I went to the local newspaper office, and I got chatting to the receptionist there, and she said, "Oh, you should put the body in the Pictish cemetery." I'd never heard of the Pictish cemetery. And it turns out to be these sort of little stone walls, I mean, only a few inches high, in a park on a direct route between where you might have a party and the student residences. So I thought, this is the perfect location.
Wow.
So sometimes it's a place you already know. And Robert Louis Stevenson once said of the Hawes Inn in Queensferry, this is a place that cries out for a murder. And that happens sometimes. You go a place and you think, oh, this would be a great place to set a crime. But more often than not, you're thinking about the crime and the nature of the crime and where would be a place that would work for the story.
Yeah. Do you start with the plot or the character?
I start with story. It's always story that sets me going. And that takes a long time to develop. There's always something that sets me off and I think, well, that's interesting. Or, oh, I didn't know that. Or, yeah, that was all right. But what happened if they believed him instead of her? Or what if it was this way instead of that way? And so I start feeling my way into a story. And very early on, I know if it's a series character, if it's Tony and Carol, if it's Karen Perry, if it's Kate Brannigan, Lindsay Gordon, or if it's going to be a standalone. And so from that point, how the story develops is dictated by whether it's standalone or series. If it's series, you have your central characters, your nexus of regulars, and the story has to fit with their existing characteristics and their abilities. If it's a standalone, you've got a completely clean sheet, so you can let the story go where it needs to go and build the characters into it. As there's a lot of sitting around going like, well, why would somebody do that instead of this? What is it in their background or their makeup that would make them be this kind of actor rather than that kind of actor?
Yeah.
So it depends. It starts with the sort of the seed of a story. And from then it becomes, it's almost like a feedback loop. Character feeds story, feeds character, feeds story.
Yeah. Okay. How many drafts do you write before handing it in?
Well, what's a draft?
Yeah.
Because I constantly revise as I'm going along. It changes in the process of writing. Yeah. And when I get to the end of what I suppose is nominally the first draft, I do a quick read-through revision and then it goes to my editor. So you could say that's the first draft, you could say that's the second draft, you could say there are bits of it that have been gone through 13 or 14 times.
Yeah. And do you have a favourite reader, first reader, Val, or do you use your agent for that?
It goes, at the same time, it goes to my agent and my editor and my partner.
Yeah, okay. Great.
Nobody sees it before it's done.
Yeah. What research did you do for your latest novel?
The one I'm writing at the moment.
Yeah.
The one I'm writing at the moment, I had to do quite a bit of research into the art world because it's set partly in that universe. and also some interesting legal questions that came up along the way that I had kind of written myself into an interesting legal corner a couple of times. So I've been bothering my lawyer contacts, saying, how would this happen? Is this possible? And luckily, it's worked out okay. That the things that didn't quite chime with what I had in my head, I've been able to work around. So it's worked out okay.
How much of a profile do you do for each character before you write them?
I don't do a profile as such, but I spend quite a bit of time with them in my head, kind of getting to know them. So by the time I start to write, I've got a sense of what their background is, where they live, whether they live alone or with someone, what their tastes are, and that kind of stays in my head. I think in the way that, when we think about our friends, we know who drinks gin and tonic and who drinks whiskey and soda, who drives a Mercedes, who drives an old junker. We just know these things. We don't have to make notes about them. So in the process of getting to know a character, I think I have the same sort of sense of these are the important things about them, and I'll remember them if they're important and significant.
Yeah.
And obviously the things that feed into what they do in the book are things that get set in stone quite quickly in my head.
Yeah. Who are your literary inspirations?
Well, it depends how you define it. I mean, I read very widely. I've always read voraciously. So in a sense, you could go right back to my childhood and my teens and go back to writers like Robert Louis Stevenson, like Agatha Christie, like Eleanor M. Brent Dyer, who wrote the Shalley School books. And I suppose moving forward, writers like Ruth Rendell, Reginald Hill, Sarah Paretsky was a big influence for me in terms of getting me kick-started. And I suppose, the thing about writing is, for me, it's a constant challenge. I want to be better. I want each book to be better than the last one, or at very least different from what I've done before. I've got no interest in writing the same book again and again and again. And we all know authors who do that, who probably should have let their series characters go a while back. And I don't want to be one of those writers. And I always hope that my team will tell me if I start to write like that. So for a writer who's committed to getting better, the one thing you have to keep doing is reading.
Yeah.
And I read a lot of debut novels, because one of the things that I do every year is I chair the panel at the Harrogate Theakston's Crime Writing Festival called New Blood. And I pick 4 debut authors to interview on stage every year. So that means I have to work my way through a lot of debuts. And I'm interested all the time by what newcomers to the field are doing, what they're bringing to the table. And also, I'm interested in watching other writers who, like me, have got a long tail with how they develop and change. So you see, Nikki French, which is, Sean and Nikki, who've been writing together for years, and then launched a few years ago into the wonderful Frida Klein series, which was a complete step away from what they've been doing before. And now they've finished writing that series and they've gone back to writing psychological thrillers. But again, I think you can see the strengths that they have developed since they moved away from it and come back to it. So it's really interesting to see, as I say, both writers at the start of their career and writers a long way down their career who are still having the courage to do things differently.
Yeah, and it is courage too, isn't it?
Yeah.
When and how do you work out your plot twists and red herrings?
Some things I know right from the start. When I start a novel, I generally know the broad shape of it. I know what outcome I'm heading for, and I usually know 1 or 2 of the crucial turning points along the way. This has to happen in order for the rest of it to play out. But a lot of the nuts and bolts of it develop as I'm going along. So I'll be thinking about, the next 3 or 4 scenes, the next 3 or 4 sections, and I'll think, oh yeah, I could do that, I could do this. And as the further into the book I get, the easier these things come to me. But and sometimes you have to go back and retrofit something. Suddenly you get sort of 3/4 of the way through and you think, oh, I could have done that. So you have to go back and do a bit of tweaking.
What's your top writing tip, and what's your top self-editing tip?
My top writing tip is to to find the times of day when you're at your most productive.
Mm.
Some of us work really well early in the morning, and I am not one of those people. And some people work really well late at night. And I think the thing is to try and find the time of day, the times of day where you're at your most productive, and focus on making sure that those are the times of day that you're at your desk.
Yeah.
So there's no point in trying to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and write if you're someone whose brain doesn't work at 5 o'clock in the morning. So find the right time of day for you and stick to it.
Yeah.
My top tip for self-editing is read it out loud.
Yeah.
There's nothing identifies the clunky sentence faster than reading it out loud to yourself.
Yeah, great. Does your main character or main characters ever surprise you?
Well, it's an interesting question. Some people have this notion that, your characters have a life of their own and they tell you what they're going to do. And I think that's basically nonsense, because your characters don't have any life that doesn't come from within you and your experience of the world and the way you think about things. But sometimes over the years you build up a character and they become many layered, and you find that you have given them a capability with those many layers that allows you to do something that when you started out, it would never have occurred to you as a possibility. So in that sense, it's possible for surprises or unexpectedness to occur. But it's not like I get up in the morning and Karen Pirie taps me on the shoulder and says, "Guess what?"
How much of you is in any of your characters?
Well, it's a common misapprehension that people make of overlaying the characters on the author. And thinking that because your character does something or thinks something or behaves in a particular way, that's how you behave. But, over the years, I've created hundreds of characters, and not one of them is me, but all of them have something of me in them.
Yeah.
As a friend of mine once said, how much of the characters is in you? More than I believe and less than I think. But
you do like porridge, don't you?
I do like porridge, yes, I do. But I don't like gin. Karen Pirie and her friend Jimmy get together on Monday nights for gin night, and they sample lots of different craft gins. And as a result of this, people keep giving me bottles of gin, and I can't stand gin. I feel I made a tactical error here. I should have had them drinking malt whiskey. But I thought gin for them fitted much better with Karen, and because there is this interest in craft gins nowadays, it was a kind of easy trope to put into the books. So the house is always full of gin that I can't drink. My partner, who's a professor of geography at St Andrews University, however, the geography department at St Andrews is perpetually grateful for this.
What's the scariest thing in your novel? So, latest novel, or you choose.
I don't know. They don't scare me, you see, because I'm in control. I know what I'm doing, and I'm in control of it, so it doesn't scare me. But the thing that most readers have come back to me time and time again about is the scene in The Mermaid Singing, the first Tony Hill and Carol Jordan novel, which features a particular instrument of torture called the Judas chair. And men in particular find this profoundly disturbing. And an interesting sideline on that is on two separate occasions, women have come up to me at events and said, I was late going into labour, and then I read The Mermaid Singing. So it's a much cheaper option than inducing a birth, really, is to give them a copy of The Mermaid Singing.
That's right. Tell us something not in your book about a main character. What have you kept to yourself?
I don't really know, because I won't know till I need it. I don't have a sort of tick list of things that are not necessary.
Yeah.
I'm very pragmatic about things. I try never to do more than is absolutely necessary, because I'm lazy.
Would you write a crime book about the pandemic?
Not for a while, because I think that big events like this need to kind of sink in. You need to look at them from distance. But I did write a 3-part radio drama about 3 years ago called Resistance, which is about a plague, basically, a pandemic. It came about because the Wellcome Trust, which is a medical charity, they set up a thing every year where they bring together writers and radio drama directors and scientists, and they choose a theme every year. And you spend a couple of days with the scientists, and then you go away and pitch the radio producers. And I listened to scientists talking about antimicrobial resistance and how the drugs don't work anymore. And I thought, well, the only thing you can do is write a plague.
Yeah.
So I went away and I wrote this drama called Resistance. Basically, it's a pandemic that sweeps the globe. Only 2 million people left alive at the end of it. And we're in the process of turning it into a graphic novel at the moment.
Wow.
Given that I also wrote a radio drama, an adaptation of John Wyndham's The Kraken Wakes, which is ultimately about rising sea levels. I have one or two friends saying, please don't write any more radio dramas.
It's all coming true.
Yeah.
How important is place in your writing?
Place is very important to me. I need to be able to see where a book is set, even if it's the fictitious city of Bradfield, where most of the Tony and Carol novels take place. I have a picture in my head now of the centre of Bradfield, at least, and its outlying suburbs. I think place is very important in the crime novel, and for me, the writers whose work I remember most clearly are the ones where you have that sense of place. Donna Leon writing about Venice, Raymond Chandler writing about Los Angeles, Sarah Paretsky in Chicago. And I think there's something, it's a little bit of a trick that crime writers use. Everybody knows that murders are not solved the way we write about them in our books. They're a repetitive, dull process of interviewing people, knocking on doors, which would not make for a very interesting novel. But to make people believe what we're telling them, we have to try and make everything else authentic. So a really strong sense of place, for someone who knows the place and recognise it, they'll be going, oh yeah, I know that street, I've been in that bar, she must be telling me the truth about everything else. And if you don't know the place, I have to describe it in such a way that it chimes with places that you do know. So I have to write about the city in terms that you would understand it relating to your city. So the vividness of the landscape draws the reader in to the atmosphere of the book and helps you as a writer convince them that what you're telling them is how it is.
Yeah, that's fabulous. What's the best way to dig yourself out of a bad plot hole?
I think the best way to dig yourself out of a bad plot hole is to think about it and let it fester. Not to panic, but one of the things I often find helpful is to sort of set myself the problem as I'm going to sleep and let my subconscious mind work on it while I'm asleep. And very often, I would say more often than not, the answer is there in the morning when I get in the shower.
Wow.
The other thing to do is to backtrack to where the plot was still working and try to think of an alternative direction to move it in.
Yep.
Sometimes you just have to tear the chapter up.
Yeah. What should you play? Who should play your central character on the screen? Well, you already have two characters on the screen, so take your pick of the others.
Well, it's a good question, that, because we're currently in development with Karen Piri, and I had a meeting just this week with the producer and the scriptwriter, and we were talking about casting. So I can't possibly say anything about that because people might think that was a clue as to what's actually going to happen.
We won't.
I don't know. I don't think about fantasy casting much, really, because I've experienced the reality, and with the exception of Robson Green, nobody in Wire in the Blood looked anything like the picture in my head.
Wow.
But sometimes you start off with a very clear picture in your head, and for a good reason. And I'm thinking now of A Place of Execution, where the detective George Bennett is essentially, he's a good man trying to do the right thing, and I really struggled with creating the character because writing a good person can be quite dull. Because they don't have bad habits, they don't do bad things to people, they don't have the sort of characteristics that wind people up. And I really struggled with this for a long time, and it was coming up to Christmas, and we were watching It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah.
And of course, Jimmy Stewart's character in that is a really good man, but what saves him from being boring is his self-doubt. He doesn't believe in his own goodness. He doesn't believe he's a nice man. He doesn't believe people value him. And I thought that's what to do, to give George Bennett the characteristics of self-doubt.
Yeah.
And so, in a kind of tip of the hat to James Stewart, I kind of pictured George Bennett as looking a bit like Jimmy Stewart, and I actually describe him in the book. So if we're ever going to make Place of Execution again, I would try to resurrect Jimmy Stewart.
Who's your favourite crime fiction character? This could be one of yours, or one of someone else's,
That's a tough one. I mean, because there's so many characters over the years that I was absolutely devoted to. I always loved Reg Hill's D.L. and Pascoe. I thought they were both great characters.
Yeah.
I'm very fond of Ellie Griffith's central characters, Ruth and Nelson. I think they're just really great characters. And the landscape is peppered with characters who I get like, oh, it's the new so and so, and I pick it up with excitement and want to be with them again. So it's really hard to narrow it down to one person that makes my heart beat faster.
Yeah. What about within your characters, Val? Who would be your favourite within yours?
Whichever one I'm writing at the moment.
Yeah.
Because they're not. I'm not thinking about them when they're not there.
Yeah. Okay.
Out of sight, out of mind.
And our last question for the episode, thank you, Val, is how would you get away with murder?
The way to get away with murder is to make it not look like murder.
Mm-hmm.
It's the little push in the small of the back at the top of a steep flight of stairs. It's the unfortunate poisonous fungus in the middle of the wild foraged mushrooms. It's anything that you can make not look like murder is the way to get away with murder.
Val McDermid, thank you for being with us on our very first episode of Murder Mondays, coming all the way from Edinburgh. Thank you.
It's a pleasure always to be with the sisters.